Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the show for rational thinking people, where we examine important issues that are either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today, it's a very great pleasure to welcome Dr. Andy Kaufman, the man who has helped inspire a great many of us thinking people in dismantling this myth of viruses and germ theory. Dr. Andy Kaufman, thank you very much for joining us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Nigel. And I really love the description of your show. It's right on par with my message as well.
Great. Andy, maybe we can start by having a look at your method, because as I mentioned there, you've been a great inspiration to many of us. Your logical and methodical approach, the way you've sort of dove straight for the fundamentals. Can you sort of give us a synopsis, if you like, or an overview of your method, the essence of your method?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I actually have, sat down and plotted this out, but it's essentially a culmination of a number of things that I've learned over the course of my career in terms of, going back to learning logic, studying philosophy in college, then later on coming up in research and learning how to critically appraise articles and studies. And that actually was a skill I learned largely when at Duke University, which is, one of the biggest promulgators of false research, interestingly. So, and then when I began conducting my own research, I also learned enough statistics that I could do my own analysis and actually used to write code in SPSS. So part of it is learning the language of mathematics, logic, and reasoning. And also, I think it's really, really important to be aware of logic fallacies, and you might want to talk about that a little bit more at length. But in terms of how I look at an issue overall, is I want to kind of use a root cause analysis type of approach. So I see, there's a phenomenon going on, right? Like I saw the phenomenon of the pandemic starting with, what happened in China. And then I saw people wearing masks in the airport on the West Coast before the, pandemic announcement and the lockdowns ensued. And at that time I said, okay, let me look at the root cause of what's going on, because they said it was a disease caused by a virus. So let me first see how the virus was discovered and look at that base level. And of course, you could actually go deeper than that and look into the theories of cell biology and of germ theory and such. And I did eventually do that, but that's where I started. And then I used a principle, which is something that I heard in my spiritual teaching several years ago, but since the pandemic started, I've heard this word come out of so many people's mouth, and it's discernment. And that is the ability to, look at specific evidence or facts or observations and say, are they reliable? Are the conclusions drawn by someone else based on that information reliable? And, you have to do a lot of questions like, for example, is there a conflict of interest? So when I look at a scientific or a medical paper, one of the first things I look at is, the authors, do they have a financial conflict or other conflict of interest with this research, right? Do they have a financial relationship with a company that based on the outcome of their research, they're either going to make money or not make money? Things like that. And those just play into all of us in subtle ways, and you have to be aware of and account for those things. But most of all, I just would look at the scientific evidence and, most importantly, look at the experiment that was conducted. So not just read the author's conclusions and take that at face value, but actually the methods section of a paper is the most important to read. So I would start there. I might read the abstract first, but then I would really go straight to the methods section and see what experiment did they actually do? What could this possibly demonstrate if the results were a certain way? And then I can look at what the results are and then make my own interpretation of what you can learn from that.
So you're clearly taking account of the broader context in there, and obviously following a principled approach, which is fabulous, because I mean it's quite ironic that your training in conventional medicine taught you how to be so ruthlessly logical. I like that. So when we look at the sort of failings in the modern health paradigm, which you've helped to uncover, although in the run up towards the pandemic, I'm sure you're aware there was a lot of research going on to do with gut health, and the epigenetics and so forth. I've been involved in looking into this as well, and a lot of these subjects implicitly undermine germ theory, rather than sort of explicit, and they're already implicitly forming the foundation for this terrain theory that perhaps we can go on to discuss as well.
But, well, Nigel, it's just, if I may interrupt for a second, it's such a good point, because like all of the research on the microbiome and gut health directly contradicts germ theory, right? And it's in support of the terrain theory, which is, long predated the modern research. So they had to come up with a cover story, right? Which is basically attributing morality to bacteria, saying that there are good bacteria and bad bacteria. We need to punish the bad bacteria and, give a pat on the back to the good bacteria.
Yeah. Yeah, so in this whole sort of crazy upside down health paradigm that must be on the way out, and the broader challenge of the whole globe at the moment, all countries, we have to try and bust this germ theory myth because of the implications of it, and this pandemic we've just had, the alleged pandemic, I should say, the treaty that's coming up, and the inevitability of more pandemics. What do you think that the fundamental problem that we face in terms of this incorrect medical paradigm, in terms of the illogical thinking of professionals in many of the sciences, and we'll come on to discuss scientism, do you think it's a psychological problem, or do you think it's more of a philosophical problem?
Well, it's kind of both. There is a philosophical underlayment to this whole thing, which is, reductionist materialism, or materialist reductionism, if you will. And that's important and crucial, actually, for the whole germ theory and medical warfare paradigm to exist. But on the other hand, you have, well, why would people adopt and accept that philosophy? And that has to do with a psychological approach, that essentially the health system and really the broader scientific establishment has undergone this type of infiltration as well. But I've studied most in detail how this has happened in the medical system. And, it really began in earnest with the creation of the Flexner Report in the early 20th century, which was a collaboration of Rockefeller and some of the other oil barons. And essentially what they did is they remade the medical education system, which is really a brilliant way to change a whole industry. And it was in the United States before that time, the medical schools were predominantly homeopathic and naturopathic, and chiropractic was growing in popularity. And that's most doctors were like that. The allopathic doctors in the 19th century were the ones giving arsenic and mercury-based chemicals, out as medicine, and they were not really in high favor among the general communities. And after this Flexner Report, which basically concluded that the allopathic, cut, burn, poison model was the only legitimate model of medicine, and so they were only going to give accreditation to medical schools, to train doctors that followed that model. And in a very short time, the number of medical schools shrunk down substantially, and the allopathic schools took up a huge market share. The other homeopathic, naturopathic, and chiropractic shrunk down in number, and it became also very expensive. The allopathic schools charged high tuition, so it was much less accessible to the common individual to get the medical training. It was now more reserved for a wealthy class, and that stayed that way until student loans came about. I believe it was in the 70s or 80s. So you basically, because you changed the whole education system, and now all the people that are going to end up being licensed as physicians and practicing medicine are all following now this one narrow model, and they're not taught about the other models. So there's this narrowing of focus, like pigeonholing, and that's continued to happen in medicine to more and more degree, especially most recently with the adaptation of the electronic health records, because what that has allowed to happen is that all of the clinical decision making is now in algorithms on the computer, and each hospital or organization, essentially, they negotiate with drug companies and medical device companies and et cetera to get the best deal for certain medications, and then that's their preferred treatments, and then they get incentives from the insurance companies for doing certain tests and such, and so they take all those business arrangements and put them into clinical practice guidelines. And then when you're the physician and you're at the computer and you have a patient that comes in and they have chest pain or whatever, you start typing that in, and then these little boxes pop up on your screen. Oh, do you want to order this test? Do you want to prescribe this drug? And if you just say yes, then essentially the decision's made for you, but you can, it saves you time, you get along just fine, and whatever happens with the patient happens.
Yeah.
But if you don't, then you're going to get called into the administrator's office, right, and they're going to say, why aren't you following our guidelines?
Okay, gotcha. I was hinting more at the sort of inability of virologists amongst other sectors of the medical cartel. How is it that so many sort of reasonably intelligent people are unable to question the methods that you have highlighted, the isolation not being isolation? I mean, thank you for pointing it out to so many of us. But the men that actually do this, and you've spoken also about in toxicology how the sort of in vitro versus in vivo, how experiments are moving further and further away from reality. How is it, do you think, this failure of to grasp logical thinking in the minds of these people that are actually doing these things? Obviously the virologists are probably the key example in this context. Where's logic gone for these people?
Right. Well, firstly, let me point out that I was definitely not the first person to uncover this truth about virology. In fact, there have even been people within virology who have been critical of these experiments, some of them who maintained their academic position, and some like Lanka, who had to divorce himself from the institution. And a lot of people, during the AIDS era, recognize this truth. Like, one of my main inspirations was Nancy Turner Banks, so I like to give her, credit. So I didn't, I didn't try to reinvent the wheel. I kind of came upon it on my own, and then I realized that a lot of other people came upon it, and that actually validates it substantially, that people independently who looked at this. So one of the main issues is that nobody's willing to actually look at these experiments and question, are they valid or not? So every time that, and there have been a lot of people, some journalists like yourself, who wanted to arrange a debate between, people like me and Tom Cowan and Sam Bailey and others who are speaking out about this truth, to debate a virologist, or even one of the other doctors who's, against the vaccines and such, but who thinks that the virus is a real thing. And none of them were really willing to actually look at the issue. None of them would read the papers and say, hey, this is how this experiment actually does prove that this is a real virus. Like, not one time was anybody willing to do that. In fact, I had this one email exchange with a virologist who we had a call first, and he was very interested in possibility to debate and understanding my position. So I gave him some information about exactly what my position is. And we took a couple of weeks break for him to look at that, then came back. And then we're trying to, he's saying, oh, yes, I would be interested in a debate. And I'm just trying to, say, okay, well, what's your reasons, or do you have any studies, other studies? And he ends up saying that, nothing can really be proven. And so it's like, it was so strange. So what I think happens is that there is a system of indoctrination that starts right with the earliest education, in kindergarten and grade school, which essentially entrains you to receive information from an authority figure, right? The teacher, the official textbook, the designated government expert, the Nobel laureate, right? All those kinds of people. And that your job is to take in and memorize and be able to regurgitate back that information, but not to look at it critically and question it and be skeptical. And it's contrary to the whole spirit and philosophy of science, which is always to challenge the status quo and try to disprove the theory of the day. Because if you can't disprove it, that's how you know it's accurate. If you can disprove it, then you can, throw it out and come up with something new. And so this continues throughout the education and through college. And then in the university, it becomes even more so, because you have the volume of information that you're expected to learn, it increases substantially. And so you're so overwhelmed with all of this that there's no time to really question things. And then if you want to become a scientist, it's competitive to get those positions and to get a grant. And it's basically an apprentice model. So if you go, to grad school to become a virologist, so you'll get some coursework at the beginning, but mostly you'll be in the laboratory first, just helping with others' research. Then you'll have to have your own thesis project. And you basically have to do what your mentors would approve. So you have to, so first you're taught, this is how we do experiments. This is a virus isolation experiment. It demonstrates a virus. And they're just told that. And then their job is to learn how to do it in a laboratory. Their job isn't to question the validity of it, right? Yeah. And so they go through that, and then they realize that if they follow what their mentor is doing and learn how to do it, then they get their paper published. Mm-hmm. And then they see that this is also how they get grant funding. So why would they question it when they're trying to develop their career and, make a living and go from, it's you get paid like $10,000, $12,000 a year as a postdoc. And as a grad student, you have to get some kind of fellowship to work to even have any money at all. So you're going from being destitute, to try to have a normal life.
Sure, I can see the nature of the trap there. But that's interesting, that comment you made right at the beginning there, Andy, about there is no proof. I mean, that tends to suggest to underlying philosophical reasons, doesn't it? And it seems to me, from my experience in this journalist capacity and my experience as a writer, investigating the concept of truth, that truth is fundamentally disvalued and discounted in our culture right across the board. And this is inevitably a result of people like this guy, a scientist, saying you can't prove anything. The idea of an objective reality to find out about, which is obviously the sort of philosophical bedrock of the concept of truth and of proof. The self-evident, A is A. All these things are there are philosophical foundations, if you like, to the concepts of proof as a form of validation. But these seem to be very discounted, don't they? It's as though our culture has steadily abandoned the notion of truth, alongside with its abandonment of the concept of reality as being an objective absolute. Would you agree with any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that the concept of real truth is not a priority at all in our culture. And it goes even beyond that, that we are actually led to not only not value truth, but actually believe things to be true that directly contradict our own experience and observation,
Absolutely.
and just to accept them.
Yeah, I mean, just a quick tangent with the example of cultural films. You know, we've all seen how films used to be set in reality and have some special effects to make them look a little bit of a wow factor. These days, the special effects are in fact a departure from reality completely. Most of the things that young people look at, you know, and film and video watching is a big part of education for young people. They're looking at things that are impossible, and they're actually processing them as happening in, you know, in this sort of blur between reality and fantasy that's watching a film. So yes, I agree with you. So how do you think that certainty is achieved? Because it's very popular in our culture amongst young people, amongst even you know, middle-aged people as well, to think that reality is unknowable, to think they sort of throw their shoulders in the air with a shrug at the sort of mainstream news, and they can't make head or tail of it, and they sort of give up with this unknowability sort of you know, driving their consciousness, as it were. How do you achieve certainty, you know, in your approach?
Well, you know, as you were just describing the unknowability, it kind of seemed to fit with nihilism, right? And which kind of goes with atheism, right? That essentially there's no purpose to our existence, and when we die, that there's nothing more, and so we should just not worry about these things, and you know, live a decadent you know, life where we indulge in all the pleasure possible in our limited existence, right? And this takes us away from the pursuit of truth. We need to have a sense of purpose, a sense of something bigger, and then we can start to trust in our own observations. You know, the idea that you know, there is some context, and that you can know some things, and some things we may be beyond our ability to understand. I actually think that that's probably true. You know, to understand everything about how, you know, our bodies work, for example, at the minute detail level, right? It may not be possible, at least in my lifetime, but there also, like, I can, you know, certainly look around and see and observe certain things, and I can know those things to be true. You know, like I can observe the shape of the world around me, or what's in the sky. I can look through a telescope even and observe light bodies in the sky, and make certain conclusions, you know, based on those observations. And those things are real. We need to, you know, trust our ability to observe and reason ourselves, and we can always test and validate that, you know, against others and have discussions. But there certainly are things that we can know, right? I know that I love my children. I know that humans can reproduce, right? I mean, these things I know with 100% certainty. And there are other things that I would like to know, but there may not be current evidence to help me understand those things, you know, at present. And then there are a lot of things put out there as true that when you examine the evidence behind them, you see that that they fall apart very quickly. And unfortunately, it's so many things that we have come to believe and were taught growing up, and that are culturally acceptable, that are like that.
Mm, yeah, I mean, I would personally just go back to nihilism or nihilism. I'm an atheist. I view that my existence as, you know, I'd like to think that I lived on beyond my physical death as a nice idea, but I don't think there's enough evidence of it for me to live you know, according to that premise. So in fact, I think the imminence of death is actually a good motivator. It motivates me to get it right first time, as it were. But that aside, I'm not sure that atheism necessarily correlates with nihilism, because it doesn't for me. And I think that purpose is something that men need to create, men being the species, need to create for themselves in their own lives. But it seems to me that the truth, it comes down to the standard of truth, really, doesn't it? It is inevitably philosophical because if people, I mean, we can know, for example, that contradictions don't exist, can't we? We can know that, the pen is the pen. We can know that we can't be hot and cold at the same time. So that there is a fundamental knowability about the metaphysically given around us, I would say. I'm sure you would agree. Viruses fall into this. Okay, they're very, very tiny, or bacteria, should we say? We can see those more easily. It's the institutions of men and the claims of men and the politics and the economics and all of these claims, I think, which are the potentially unknowable. So when your approach with this, where's the virus? There's no virus because we haven't found any evidence for its existence. So that shows that it can't be said to be cause of any particular disease, which goes on to sort of illustrate that there can't be any need for vaccinations. And it's interesting because these three things that you've helped us to see, and the other people like you who have been discussing this issue, challenging this issue, the existence of viruses. When you know that something is false, it's interesting to look around and see all of the different institutions and quarters and the different people that are still claiming that that's true. I mean, I'm sure you probably have some thoughts on the deliberateness of this deception versus the cock-up theory. Some people like to think cock-up theory. Do you think this is all part of a deliberate plan? And do you think that it's also very valid to be able to uncover a falsity? So that the falsity you've uncovered is the existence of the virus. In other areas such as climatology, somebody might challenge that. But with the issue of falseness, you've identified something as false, and that's immensely powerful, isn't it? Because it sheds light on this deceptiveness or not. Can you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, this is, so there's a logic point to this, which is very key, and I'm glad that you described it accurately, because a lot of people feel or think that I actually am proposing a theory, or the no virus theory.
Yeah. No.
But it's actually the opposite way around. It's like the virus causing disease. That's a theory that's been proposed or a claim that's been made, and as you pointed out, there's been a lot of things built upon that. Right? The things that affect our day-to-day life have been built upon that. So it's really important that claim, since it's foundational, that it has to be true in order for all the other things to be reasonable. And just saying, okay, well, is there evidence to support that claim? And I simply looked at the evidence and said, actually, it doesn't support that claim. So therefore, the claim is false. Unless there's new evidence that lends it weight. So there's really, it's not only illogical, but it's unjust to then develop policy affecting the lives of individual men and women based on something that's false. So this is really, really important. So why is there such an effort to maintain this falsehood? Well, I think it's different for different people. Like for most average men and women, it's simply a matter of, oh, well, all my life I knew this was true. It's silly to challenge it. Who would challenge that? Everybody knows that, right? And if you did challenge it, first of all, it would be intimidating. It'd be like, oh, all this science, I can't understand science. A lot of people believe that, although everyone is capable of it. It's not really, they use very difficult language when they describe it and write about it, that you need someone to translate that for you. But once it's translated, you'll find that it's actually, it's not much different than making a recipe for a nice meal. Yeah. You can understand that. You can understand most experiments. So that's a barrier. And then you have all of the special interests that are built upon this falsehood. And that is, I think the biggest part of the problem. Now, some of those people at the higher levels may be, wanting to keep it around to manipulate and control people in various ways. But most of the folks who are pushing this, like, they have a financial incentive to keep it going. So if, for example, like, let's just say that you're a doctor, right? And you work in the emergency department. Well, you have people come in all the time with, acute illnesses that you say are viral infections, and you treat them a certain way based on that. Well, let's say that you arrived at the truthful conclusion that none of these diseases are caused by viruses. And then these people came to the hospital. What would you do? If you if you wanted to, do like some kind of detox protocol with them, the hospital would say, what the hell is this? Not the standard of care, you're fired, right? So you'd lose your job. You'd have to then figure things out and deal with all the fallout from that. If you're a pharmaceutical company that manufactures vaccines, vaccines are one of the highest revenue generating classes of therapeutics that exist. It's tens of billions of dollars in the United States each year, probably way more since COVID. So you'd be giving up all of that business. So why would you, question it? And so even within the truth community, this truth is being actively suppressed. You see a lot of the more prominent figures, experts, medical and scientific experts, just dismissing it outright. Oh, well, not in my experience, that's not true. Or like, well, this other scientist, I trust them and they say viruses are real. Or, you have one of the most prominent figures, RFK Jr., when he was asked this question, he basically said, I'm not qualified to answer. Well, if you're the largest proponent that vaccines are dangerous, how could you not be qualified to look at the issue of if viruses are real?
Yeah.
Right? So there is this big effort to silence this narrative and to not invite people speaking about this to the bigger events. The media never, offers us any kind of exposure. They only, basically hit pieces.
Yeah.
Right? We're not going to get on Joe Rogan.
Let's talk about science a little bit more, and it's the fact that so many people or so many areas of science seem to have departed from reality. I mean, you could say, if we are injecting people with vaccinations, which, if there's no virus, is doing no good, but they're full of adjuvants, we're clearly harming people. So again, we have an example of when we don't act according to truth, suffering is the inevitable outcome, isn't it? It's just
to add one thing to that, because and this is a little bit of a biblical reference, because most people don't know the true meaning of what it means to sin. Right? To sin is not to do an evil deed. It's actually to miss the mark. And that's what you're talking about here. When you miss the mark, in other words, you miss the truth about illness, that's the sin and the consequences that people have for their health, right? That's the consequences of that missing the mark.
Okay. Yeah. So, logical fallacies, it does seem, you're a psychiatrist, you're a qualified psychiatrist. You must be aghast when you look at the sort of mainstream population who seem to, be so easily led by logical fallacies, appeals to emotion, appeals to authority, as you mentioned earlier on. Do you think this, again, is sort of systemic in our culture? It certainly appears to be when we look around. And does that affect your optimism or pessimism for any, positive or negative outcome in terms of, freedom or tyranny on this medical issue?
Right. Well, any misuse of logic could only lead to tyranny and not to freedom. But it's a combination of factors, because one thing is people are not taught how to argue, debate, and reason logically.
Yeah.
right? It's not part of our general education. In fact, it's discouraged,
Mm.
right? So you have that aspect um, about it. And then, when people do get into an argument, they often are ruled by emotions, or they're not really arguing. Like, so, there's a way to approach a discussion where you're open-minded. And if you hear information that is valuable, that you're willing to change your opinion. Like, for example, I came from the position that viruses cause disease, right? I vaccinated my children. I got vaccinated. I just trusted that what I was being taught in medical school was accurate. And then I was, looked at the evidence, and I found out that actually I was misled. And then I had to change my whole way of thinking to a new way of thinking in order to adapt to this new information. And if you don't go into an argument with that mindset, it's never going to be a productive argument. And that's what you have is, so people enter into this public debate or private debate basically saying, I'm gonna argue my opinion no matter what. I'm not gonna really listen. And that's when that logic fallacy comes in, because if you don't have a real argument, then you use logic fallacy. And every time I've gotten into an argument about this, the other side always goes right to logic fallacy.
Yeah.
They never, I never do that. I'm very conscious of it. I just stick with the science, right? Tell me how here's why I think this experiment doesn't prove viruses. If you have a different position, tell me how this experiment does prove the existence of viruses. And then what I get is, well, you're not a virologist, I'm a virologist. Okay, what does that have to do with it, right? That's the appeal to authority, right, that you're mentioning. And every other fallacy in the book, like I mentioned before, oh, prove your theory of no viruses. Oh, what do you mean? I have no burden of proof, right? So that's another logic fallacy. Or, well, if it's not a virus, then tell me what is causing it. Also irrelevant.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, these things, they really do illustrate clearly the fact that you have to look for the logical argument. And this is one of my core fundamental principles, if you like, in truth seeking, is that you have to follow the logical argument. You have to look for it, and you have to assess it. And as you say, you have to be very mindful of these logical fallacies. But again, the concept of logic and the concept of proof and all of these things very much swing back to this idea of reality being objective, absolute. Which I mean, I wanted to ask you because I mean, it sounds like you're not an atheist like I am. I kind of presumed you were in the early days because you were so logical, but I feel compelled to ask what your standard for truth would be in your when you've got your scientific hat on.
Well, let me say that actually part of the reason why I was led away from atheism was due to logic, because I could not find another explanation for our existence as such sophisticated creatures without some other intelligent form. Now, I don't subscribe to a particular set of religious beliefs, and I don't really know exactly what this, intelligence is, but I think there's also some other experimental evidence that supports, non-material entities or of some kind, like the double slit experiment, for example. Mm-hmm. But, not to get into a philosophical, because I always accept everyone's opinion as valid as long as they have reasons for it that make sense. And this is more of a personal, belief, because I can't say that I have,
Sure.
direct.
Well, I don't. It's not my intention.
Right?
It's not my intention to.
Oh, no. But it's good. It's good to bring these things up and just have them, be open for discussion, because,
if I can interject, forgive me.
Yeah.
I think this is of ultimate importance for any seekers of truth, because I'm aware of Austin Vida's experiments, Masaru Emoto, etc., and the water idea, and your work is delving into that. I appreciate, and I'm fascinated by that, and I wouldn't deny any of that for a moment. But it seems to me that this issue is of fundamental importance. The question being, is reality the primacy of existence versus the primacy of consciousness? Because again, what we see widespread in our culture is an implicit adherence to the primacy of consciousness, so that consciousness is what creates reality. I'm sure you're familiar with this. It's an implicit tenet to most religions, and there are secular versions to it as well. The fact that we create our own reality, or one, these sorts of things. But my concern, as somebody who spent most of my life as a mystic, holding these ideas to be true, my concern now is that if we undermine the concept of our standard of truth as objective reality is the only possible standard of truth that I can see, if we undermine that, then we have no ability to argue for anything, our freedom or the non-existence of viruses or anything, unless we're standing on a premise that accepts that reality is what it is, and it's not malleable by consciousness. So maybe you can join in the debate about that. I mean, I know there's this water thing, and consciousness can clearly have an effect on water. It makes an impression on water in some shape or form. And again, these are just facts of reality that we're discovering. But do they imply that consciousness creates reality? And maybe we can discuss the double slit experiment.
Well, I mean, it's also like, what exactly do you mean by reality? Like, consciousness can't change, sort of the laws or boundaries of physics, right? For example, like it, can't make a mirror, not reflect light, or, something like that. But so you could say, think about it this way, right? Each action that you take as an individual is, aside from, some automatic actions like breathing and such, but each deliberate action is preceded by a thought, right? And the thought is in your consciousness before it becomes, existing in the real world. And then you, as an individual man or woman, you're capable of creating things, not of creating the world, but of creating an invention, a work of art, a device, et cetera, or creating ideas and that can actually spread and become prominent as well. So in that sense, there is, I think, a logical progression of consciousness leading to creation of certain things, but there is also, I believe, there is an absolute truth to the nature of the world, of the cosmology that we exist in. And we can use observation and analysis and experimentation to learn about that world. And that is being done. Of course, there's some limits to that because there are some barriers in our ability, people allowing us to explore things, or might be too expensive to, be able to do certain experiments. But yeah, there, absolutely, there is an objective truth about the nature of the world, that we can, through experience, come to learn and understand, more and more, over our existence.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I would agree with that, and I'm kind of pleased to hear you say that, because again, I can't see that there can be any other standard of truth. If there is, somebody please tell me.
Right. Well, there's a lot of corruption and obfuscation of this kind of spirituality, right? That there's the New Age movement, for example, right? And those, organized movements corrupt a lot of these ideas, because, this idea about an absolute truth came to me initially like from a spiritual mentor, a spiritual teacher, right? Someone from the Western esoteric tradition, but who, already, was not associated with any organized, groups,
Yeah.
right? And looks at all different, religious doctrine and literature.
Yeah.
So to draw these conclusions. So it's like there is this way that you can blend these different areas of thinking and philosophy and belief that's compatible with logic and reason and truth. And so
Yeah.
that's the point that that's where we have our common ground.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems that ideas are powerful, aren't they? I mean, ideas motivate people. They are very powerful. They motivate individuals. They motivate civilizations. They steer civilizations. And it seems to me that ideas around medicine have been messed with. We know the Pasteur, Beauchamp theory, with germ theory, terrain theory. We've seen ideas messed with in other areas of science around climatology and stuff like that. We've seen ideas of monetary science and the central banking and the Federal Reserve. We've seen deception around that. We've seen a lot of foul play, I would suggest, over a great many decades in twisting ideas. And I suppose one of the things that fascinates me is that a lot of people they seem to hold certain areas of science above suspicion whilst questioning others. And a great example, of course, is quantum physics. And, one of the high priests of scientism, Albert Einstein. Now, Albert Einstein is held as untouchable by everybody implicitly who hasn't really done some research and some questioning around some of the ideas he espoused, I should say. But with the double slit experiment, this is a classic one where the interpretation is trusted, and the interpretation being sort of, essentially that consciousness can affect whether or not a particle, a waveform collapses into a particle of actual existence. So we've, whenever you hear people talking about you can create your own reality, they always cite the double slit experiment, without considering, for example, that the double slit experiment in its day is the equivalent of germ theory and the push for vaccinations today, or the equivalent of a false flag terrorism claim, or, the climate is, we've got its climate emergency, we're all going to die in 20 years. So I think we have to sort of broaden our questioning across, all of these areas of science, and realize that ideas they seem to have been twisted in so many areas. Would you agree? I mean, obviously you've told us about how this has happened in medicine. Do you see this as more universal?
Well, no, absolutely. And I don't actually share that exact interpretation of the double slit experiment. To me, the interpretation without further experiments is only that some non-material aspect affected the outcome of the experiment. Now, that may or may not be consciousness.
Yep.
It could be the electromagnetic field from the body or something like that. But
or the ether. I mean, there was a lot of
yes.
There was an explanation that brought in the ether, which was widely held to be what space consisted of, wasn't it? Prior to 19.
Well, that's exactly where I was going, because since you mentioned Einstein, who is known for relativity, not quantum mechanics, but the Michelson-Morley experiment.
Yes.
Right, which was a very important experiment that was done, and essentially what it showed was that the Earth was stationary, but that was not compatible with the current paradigm of cosmology, that the Earth was rotating around the sun.
Exactly.
So Einstein really developed the general relativity theory to reinterpret the Michelson-Morley experiment such that the Earth is moving, but it had to cancel out the ether out of the equation. Yeah. And the ether was already scientifically accepted and established in physics. In fact, the Maxwell equations on electricity and magnetism, which are used still today, right, in engineering to actually construct electromagnetic devices.
Yeah.
Those equations account for the ether. So after relativity and after this correction factor, essentially a constant, was added to the Michelson-Morley experiment to reinterpret it, they had to then develop a mathematical modification for the Maxwell equations. Except when they used it, the things the engineers made didn't work. So this is like a big cover up that still exists to this day,
Yeah,
in physics and engineering. And
absolutely.
but the ether is, absolutely a real thing. But cutting it out of the equation has essentially led us well astray. And then
Yeah.
recently in theoretical physics, we've heard about this, and in particle physics, right? Dark matter, right? Now, dark matter is really the ether. And that so they needed to add the ether back in to make sense of the physics. But they couldn't call it that because that's considered like a quack term for a physicist.
Yeah.
And so they call it dark matter, but it's essentially the ether back into the equation.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah. I mean, overall, the point here is that there's a lot of shenanigans and deception and twisting going on everywhere. I mean, Einstein coming up with reasons to, there was another famous experiment he was part of with his theory of the light bending as they took measurements of an eclipse, a total eclipse at two different parts of the world around about 1918, 1919, I think it was, and it ties in at this sort of same time. But the idea that the Michelson-Morley experiment smashes the heliocentric model, we should all be, genuinely scientific community should be should be questioning these sorts of things. But anyway,
Yeah, and the Michelson-Morley experiment is really critical because it's been repeated dozens of times, and they've tried to improve the technique of the experiment to make sure that they're, not measuring an artifact or they're confounding factors. And each time the same results happen, that all
yeah.
have the same interpretation that the Earth is stationary.
Yeah, this is very interesting because I'm just a very quick plug for Simon Shack, who a brilliant researcher who's come up with an alternative model of our solar system called the Tychos. It's an illustration of how genuine progression of genuine science is really in the hands of the private individuals at the moment. It's certainly not in any institutional sciences. But to sort of come back to the point, ideas are very powerful and they really influence people. And it seems to me that in the truth-seeking community, as we examine the medical paradigm, and you've helped us to do that, we need to also bear in mind that there are many other areas of so-called science that are scientism, and we've abandoned truth in. And perhaps we can
Every area of science, Nigel.
yeah, thank you. And the important thing is, we've got to bust this germ theory myth, haven't we? I mean, I know you're right on this. Not only for the sake of knowing how to achieve health, to get a proper, accurate understanding of disease and health that corresponds with the facts of reality, but also because this whole issue is going to lead us into tyranny, isn't it? I mean, this is the big deal about it. Would you agree? The fact that under the guise of a scary little particle that we're all transmitting, we become the problem. We can be quarantined. We can be locked down. And with these pandemic treaties, the point is that this medical issue, this old paradigm, this germ theory, is going to be used to enslave us unless we can bust it. Would you agree that's the big important point?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, you can see how different types of crises have been used to manipulate, people, like the problem reaction solution method, right? So,
Yeah.
and, you can look at terrorism is really another, whether the terrorist act was real or not, it's still used that way, right? Where they basically, that created a fear and vulnerability in people. And then while they're in that vulnerable state, you push policies that would never be acceptable during a normal time. But when people are in that panic and fear state, they allow it to pass. And so the, scary virus, epidemic, pandemic paradigm now has been really, they've tried this many times, by the way, and it's kind of fallen flat on its feet, right? Like where they even had the governments ordering lots of vaccines for the swine flu a few years ago, and then it kind of fizzled out, like they weren't able to push it over the edge. But
Yeah.
now they've been extremely successful. They got their formula exactly right, and they're going to use this.
Yeah.
And where what they really want is the digital ID. That's the cornerstone of the system that they're trying to implement, because that will be the one and only gateway that you will have into this new kind of technocratic, surveillance state that, the World Economic Forum and the UN have written about extensively. And it's gonna, it's sold as a vaccine passport, right? That's how they can use the health crisis to get people to sign on to that, and kind of, veiling it in, oh, well, this is just, so you can travel during this pandemic, so everybody will be safe, and then it'll be, turned into a social credit score. It'll be your only gateway to the financial system, et cetera. And then once you're part of that, there's, how do you get out of that situation?
Yes.
So if you keep falling for this trick, that's where you're going to end up.
So given that, I don't know about your neck of the woods there in New York, but certainly during the pandemic here, I would routinely be the only person in a supermarket full of hundreds of people without a mask on my face. And I can't help but feel a little alone in circumstances like that. I can't help but think, shit, where are all the thinking people? Where are all the logical thinkers? Where are all the people who can see through this? So given the importance of this issue, Andy, do you remain optimistic that sufficient people are going to stand up and get involved here? I mean, we've got the pandemic treaty that's just going through at the moment behind the scenes. How optimistic are you, and in the light of people's inability to think logically, as we've discussed?
Well, I'm optimistic and pessimistic. So, there already are a lot of people who have demonstrated their ability to see through what's going on. And many of those people have already taken steps to start forming, the infrastructure of what you might call a parallel society.
Yeah.
Which means moving out to the country, setting up homesteads, starting to do things for yourself, produce your own food, become part of a community, and have alternative ways of making a living.
Yeah.
And so I know that, for me, like, I feel optimistic that I've taken those steps. I'm going to be part of a community. I'm going to stay outside, and there's going to be some really lonely, lean time more to come, and as this transition takes place. But I feel that I'm going to be able to kind of live a life on my own terms for the most part, with some adversity. But that's, part of the existence on Earth is facing adversity.
Yeah.
And so I'm prepared for that, whatever it is. I'm not necessarily looking forward to it or relishing it, but I will accept it however it is and maintain my separation from that, slavery system.
Yeah.
It will be really difficult to see many people getting absorbed into it. And, and I think that I am pessimistic for a large majority of the people that they will become part of that system, unwittingly for many of them. Some of them will want to be part of that. It will become their new identity. And there'll be a massive, there's already been a major polarization of people, divided by this very issue. Like, we all see it within our own families, within our own circle of friends, that we have had to end and separate many relationships, even with people that, are our blood or that we're super close to. Many marriages have broken up over these issues.
Yeah.
And I feel that this is going to continue to happen, that this is part of the bigger picture of what's going on. And, I don't know how many people will really find the truth and embody it in their day-to-day living. I hope that it's enough to maintain communities and humanity. And I feel optimistic that it will be enough, but I think it will be just barely enough at first. And then over time, those people who are not totally sucked into the new system will migrate out of it. And I think ultimately, no system of tyranny has ever lasted, right? Humans have always found a way out eventually. And I think the same thing is destined to happen in this situation. How long it will take, how much adversity, how many people will perish, I can't answer any of those questions. But, ultimately, I think, that humanity will end up where it's supposed to be, in a good place.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, there are people like Patrick Wood and his technocracy idea. He does caution that tyranny has never endured before, but we don't know. Obviously, history repeats itself. We can't be certain, but it certainly looks like with a certain level of technology in place, it can be harder to break free from. Do you think there might be a time? The likes of you and I are by definition, by the conversations we have and the arguments we're making for truth and freedom, we're effectively adversaries of our governments. We could be said to be enemies of the state in some shape or form. Do you think it might be necessary eventually to sort of, if we're to reject our social credit score track and trace device of the smartphone, do you see a time where in your community you might have to abandon the use of the internet in order to not be a visible troublemaking dissident?
Yeah, absolutely. I fully expect to be cut out of some of these main systems, and I think there'll probably be a way to pirate back in or utilize the dark web, because in these situations in the past and even in the present that they're going on in some parts of the world, black markets develop and alternative communication systems. And so I expect there to be a period of very limited access, and then there to be an alternative. That's why I have things like a ham radio and I think if you're cut out of the banking system, then you can still use real money like precious metals or, property that has value as a means of exchange. Mm-hmm. So thinking about alternatives like that. And there'll be, like this, there are places in the developing world now, for example, where many of the common people don't have bank accounts. They don't have, credit or debit cards. I think they all have cell phones or smartphones, but they don't have, access. I mean, even in the United States, right? Many people don't have bank accounts, right? They use money orders and things like that. And so in many of these economies, there are like middlemen that go between the system, right? They might provide even financing. They will go and buy things that you need to be in the system to buy and then resell them to people out in a community who don't have access to those resources. So the same kind of black markets, I think, will, pop up and support this, fringe communities, if you will, outside the system. I mean, even in the World Economic Forum documents where they talk about what the future will be like, they describe they call them something like malcontents or whatever, who are still living out in the woods and raising their own food and such. So I think this, will be a real thing. Even in Aldous Huxley's book, right? I mean, this was kind of a feature of the story, right? That there was the community of heathens. And so I'll be one of them.
Yeah, me too. I've been trying to sort of develop these sort of outside the matrix components to my life for some time. I think it's a very important thing to do. So Andy, thank you very much for your time today. Any words in closing? Any sort of advice, if we can call it that, for people, or sort of positive suggestions, or indeed any plugs of any of your work that's coming up? If you'd like to mention anything along those lines, please do.
Well, I'd just like to say, I encourage people to be open-minded and be willing to challenge your current opinions and conclusions about various things. And I encourage you to look into these things yourself, that you do have the intelligence and the ability to understand all of these aspects, even within various fields of science. Even if they're mathematically intensive, I think there's still material that's accessible that can help you understand these things, and that you should learn to trust yourself and your own thinking and reasoning and logic to make your own opinions. And that will help you be true to yourself, help you navigate these challenging times. And so that's a big part of my message, and I'm trying to help people do that by, taking this scientific material and explaining it in a way that's more accessible, to the average non-scientist of average intelligence. And so in my mission, of course, I do a lot of education, and one of the things, you mentioned a little bit about water earlier, and that is an area that I'm intensely researching, not really just the work of Veda and Emoto, but actually the work of Gerald Pollack and Gilbert Ling, looking at the real hard science about water. And it's amazing because water is so fundamental to life, right? 99 out of every 100 molecules in our body is water. And water is not just a passive environment. It actually is active in all our body's processes. And this has not been acknowledged by mainstream biology at all. But the science is clear, and this, comes from mainstream university science. This is not even independent, people in the community doing experiments like we're talking about with cosmology. This is, in academic labs. And part of this is we have really a pandemic of dehydration and of improper hydration. People, they don't know how to tell when they're thirsty, don't know what water to drink, how to drink properly, how to tell when they're hydrated. And so much disease is really attributable almost exclusively to just problems with the water. So I have a workshop coming up next month, and you can go to andrewkaufmanmd.com to find out about it. And maybe I'll try to give you the link, but I'm going to basically teach you all about water, why it's so important, how to, treat your water optimally, how to drink properly, like very, very practical kind of information. It can make huge, huge improvements to your health. Even if you're not really ill and you just have some joint pain or some sluggishness, it could turn those things totally around just by drinking water properly. So I hope that people will consider joining me for that, because I think it's really the most important and easiest thing that we can all do to improve our health.
And of course, your wonderful film Terrain, I would encourage people who haven't seen that to check that out as well. Andy, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. On behalf of many people all over the place, thank you for your work and the insights that you've shared. You've been a fantastic component to this whole movement for truth and freedom. So thank you on behalf of lots of people for that. And thank you all for listening. Once again, I urge you all to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's stacks more on there. And do join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see. Be